A wealthy businessman walks into a luxury restaurant only to freeze when he sees his missing wife working there as a waitress pregnant. She disappeared 6 months ago without a word. Now she acts like a stranger and carries a secret that could change everything. What really happened to her? And why does the truth lead back to his own family? If you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. And hey, how are you doing today? Hope you're doing well. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Ethan Carter had been to hundreds of expensive restaurants in his life, but that night, nothing about the place felt special to him. The lighting was perfect, the kind that made everything look softer and more expensive than it actually was. The quiet hum of conversations blended with the faint sound of glasses clinking, creating the kind of atmosphere people paid for just to feel important. Normally, Ethan fit right into that world. He was the kind of man people noticed when he walked in, not because he tried, but because everything about him suggested power: his tailored suit, his calm expression, the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. But tonight he barely noticed any of it. His mind was somewhere else, stuck in a loop he couldn't escape, replaying the same question over and over again: why did she leave? 6 months, it had been 6 months since Olivia disappeared from his life, like she had never existed at all. No note, no explanation, nothing. One day she was there, sitting on the edge of their bed, asking him if he would be home for dinner, and the next day, she was gone. At first, he had been angry, that kind of cold, sharp anger that made everything feel simple. She left, so she must not have cared. That was the story he told himself, and for a while it worked. It was easier to believe she didn't love him than to accept that something had gone wrong in a way he didn't understand. But anger doesn't last forever, it fades, and when it does, it leaves behind something heavier: regret, confusion. A quiet, persistent emptiness that no amount of work or money could fill. Ethan, are you even listening? The voice pulled him back to the present. Claire, his business partner for the evening, was looking at him with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. She had been talking about the deal they were supposed to finalize tonight, something worth millions, something that would have excited him any other day. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to focus. Yeah, he said, though it was obvious he hadn't heard a word. Claire sighed but didn't push it. She had worked with him long enough to know when he was somewhere else entirely. A waitress approached their table then, her steps quiet, almost careful, like she was trying not to disturb anything. Ethan didn't look up at first. He reached for the menu, more out of habit than interest, scanning the list of dishes without really seeing them. Good evening, the waitress said softly, her voice polite and controlled, the kind of tone trained into people who worked in places like this. Can I start you off with something to drink? And that was when everything stopped. It wasn't the words, it was the voice. Something about it slipped past all the noise in his head and hit something deeper, something he hadn't been able to shut off no matter how hard he tried. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Ethan lifted his eyes. For a second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. It felt like one of those moments in a dream where things look familiar but wrong at the same time. The woman standing in front of him wore a simple black uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression neutral in that professional way that revealed nothing. But it was her, it was Olivia, his Olivia, or at least the person who used to be her. He didn't breathe, he couldn't. Everything inside him seemed to freeze, like his body had forgotten how to function. She looked different. Thinner somehow, even though that wasn't the first thing that caught his attention. The first thing, the only thing really, was her stomach. Round. Impossible to ignore, pregnant. The word formed in his mind slowly, like it didn't belong there, like it was something his brain was trying to reject. Pregnant. His thoughts scattered, crashing into each other without making sense. When, how? And then, a question he didn't want to ask but couldn't stop himself from thinking: whose child? Sir, Olivia said again, her voice steady, almost too steady, like she had practiced keeping it that way. There was no recognition in her tone, no hesitation, nothing that suggested she knew him at all. It was like she had erased him completely. That hurt more than anything else. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was staring at her now, openly, trying to find something familiar in her face. There were shadows under her eyes, faint lines of exhaustion that hadn't been there before. She looked tired. Not just physically, but in a deeper way, like something inside her had been worn down over time. Claire followed his gaze, her confusion growing. Do you know her? She asked, her voice lower now, cautious. Ethan didn't answer, he couldn't. Because saying it out loud would make it real. Olivia finally looked at him directly then, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by that same blank professionalism, but Ethan saw it, he knew he did. Recognition. Pain, something unresolved. I'll give you a few more minutes, Olivia said quietly, already stepping back. It was too easy, too quick. Like she was trying to escape before anything could happen. That snapped something in him. Olivia, he said, her name coming out rough, unfamiliar on his tongue after months of not saying it. She stopped. Not fully, just enough to show she had heard him. The entire restaurant seemed to shrink in that moment, the noise fading into the background as everything narrowed down to the space between them. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Wait, Olivia, as in she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ethan pushed his chair back, the sound louder than it should have been in a place like this. People nearby glanced over, but he didn't care. None of it mattered anymore. Not the dinner, not the deal, not the people watching. The only thing that mattered was the woman standing in front of him pretending he didn't exist. What are you doing here? He asked, the question sounding wrong even as he said it. It wasn't really what he meant. What he meant was, where have you been? Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me? But all of that got tangled up and came out as something much simpler, something that didn't even begin to cover it. Olivia turned back slowly, her face calm but her hands tightening slightly around the notepad she was holding. I'm working, she replied, emphasizing the word just enough to create distance between them. Like that was all there was to it. Like that explained everything. Ethan's gaze dropped again, drawn back to her stomach despite him, so it was real. It wasn't something he imagined. She was pregnant. And suddenly everything felt heavier, more complicated, more urgent. 6 months. The timeline lined up too perfectly, and that realization hit him harder than anything else. If it was his, then she had left carrying his child, and he hadn't even known. The thought made his chest tighten painfully. Claire stood up then, clearly uncomfortable. Okay, I'm gonna step outside, she muttered, sensing she was no longer part of this situation. Ethan barely registered her leaving. He was still looking at Olivia, trying to understand how everything had changed so much without him even realizing it. She looked like a stranger, but at the same time she didn't. And that was the worst part. Because beneath everything, the uniform, the exhaustion, the distance, she was still her. And he had no idea how to reach her anymore. Olivia shifted her weight slightly, like she was uncomfortable standing there, like every second stretched longer than it should. I've other tables, she said, her tone polite again, controlled, safe from him. That was when Ethan realized something he hadn't expected. She wasn't just distant. She was protecting herself from him. And somehow that hurt more than her disappearance ever had. Ethan didn't remember how long he stood there after Olivia walked away, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. It only felt longer because everything inside him was moving too fast, thoughts crashing into each other, none of them fully forming. He knew one thing, though: he couldn't just sit back down and pretend nothing had happened. Not after seeing her. Not after seeing that. He turned abruptly, ignoring the curious looks around him, and headed toward the back of the restaurant where the staff disappeared in and out through a narrow door. Someone called his name, maybe Claire, maybe a waiter, but he didn't stop. For the first time in a long time, he didn't care how it looked. He pushed the door open and stepped into the kitchen. The noise hit him immediately, orders being shouted, pans clanging, the sharp hiss of something hitting hot oil. It was chaotic in a way that felt completely separate from the polished calm of the dining area. For a moment he hesitated, out of place in his suit among people moving quickly with purpose. Then he saw her. Olivia was standing near a metal counter, her back half turned to him, one hand resting against the surface like she needed the support. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and for a second he thought she might be crying. The thought twisted something in his chest. Olivia, her name came out quieter this time, but it cut through the noise anyway. She stiffened, not dramatically, just enough that he noticed. Slowly she turned to face him, and whatever softness had been there before was gone. Her expression was guarded now, like she had already decided how this conversation was going to go and wasn't willing to let it change. You shouldn't be back here, she said, her voice low but firm. Customers aren't allowed. It sounded like something she had said many times before, something safe and practiced. Ethan took a few steps closer anyway. We need to talk. He didn't bother softening it. There wasn't time for that. Olivia shook her head almost immediately. There's nothing to talk about. She tried to move past him, but he stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her completely. Just enough to make it clear he wasn't going to let this end that easily. You disappeared, he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. 6 months, Olivia, you vanished. And now I find you here. Like he stopped himself, glancing briefly around the kitchen, aware of eyes on them. Like none of that ever happened. Olivia's jaw tightened, because it didn't happen the way you think it did. That was the first crack, small but real. Ethan caught it immediately. Then explain it to me, he said more quietly now. Because I've been trying to figure it out for 6 months, and I still don't understand. For a moment, she didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked this time, like she was weighing something in her head. Then she let out a slow breath, like she was already tired of a conversation that hadn't even started yet. I'm working, she repeated, but there was less force behind it now. I can't just stand here and take a break, Ethan interrupted. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. It wasn't really a request, but he tried to make it sound like one. Olivia hesitated again, and he could see the conflict on her face. Finally, she turned to one of the other staff members, said something quick under her breath, then walked toward the back exit without looking at him. Ethan followed. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter. The noise of the kitchen faded as the door swung shut behind them, leaving them in a narrow alley lit by a single flickering light. It wasn't the kind of place Ethan was used to being, but none of that mattered right now. Olivia leaned against the wall, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach, and for a second, she looked like she might collapse from sheer exhaustion. Up close, it was even more obvious. She was thinner than he remembered, her face drawn, her movements slower. And the pregnancy, it wasn't something he could ignore anymore. Start talking, she said, her voice flat. You wanted answers. Ethan stared at her, trying to figure out where to even begin. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. But one stood out above the rest, louder than all the others. The baby, he said, his eyes dropping briefly before forcing himself to look back at her face. Is it mine? The silence that followed felt heavier than anything he had experienced that night. Olivia didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, and for a moment the guard dropped again. He saw something raw there. Hurt, maybe anger, maybe both. Yes, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. It's yours. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had thought about the possibility the moment he saw her, but hearing it confirmed was different, real, immediate. His mind tried to catch up, running through timelines, memories, everything overlapping in a way that made it hard to think straight. Why didn't you tell me, he asked, his voice tightening. Why didn't you come to me? Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. Come to you, she repeated, and say what? Hey Ethan, your father just threatened to take my child away from me, but don't worry. I'm sure everything will be fine if I stay. The words came out sharper now, edged with something that had clearly been building for a long time. Ethan blinked, thrown off balance. My father, he repeated. What are you talking about? Olivia pushed herself off the wall, standing straighter despite the fatigue that still showed in her posture. You really don't know, she said, and it wasn't a question. Of course you don't. Why would you? There was bitterness in her voice now, no longer hidden. He came to see me while you were at work, not once, multiple times. At first it was polite, subtle. Comments about how I didn't fit into your world, how things would be easier for everyone if I just stepped aside. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Then he found out I was pregnant. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. What did he say? He asked, though part of him already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Olivia met his eyes, and this time she didn't look away. He said that a child like that, your child, belonged to your family. Not to me. He said he had lawyers, connections, that he could make sure I never got custody. Her voice didn't shake, but there was something underneath it that made it clear she hadn't been as calm when it first happened. He told me I could leave quietly, take some money, and start over somewhere else. Or I could stay and fight a battle I had no chance of winning. That's not. Ethan started, but the words died before he could finish them. Because the truth was, it was exactly the kind of thing his father would do. He had seen it before, just never directed at someone. Why didn't you tell me? He tried again, weaker this time. Olivia shook her head slowly. Because every time I tried to talk about him, you defended him, she said. You always had an excuse. He doesn't mean it like that. He's just looking out for me. You overthinking it. Do you remember saying those things? Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face said enough. I realized something, Olivia continued, softer now but no less painful. If I told you everything, you wouldn't believe me. Not really. Not over him, and I couldn't risk that. Not with the baby. Her hand tightened slightly against her stomach, protective without her even seeming to notice it. So I left, before he could do anything. Before he could take that choice away from me. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all pressing down on him in a way that made it hard to stand still. You've been alone this whole time, he asked. Olivia gave a small nod, moving around, staying out of sight. Doing whatever I had to do. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a quiet statement of fact. And somehow that made it worse. Ethan looked at her again, really looked this time. And everything he had missed over the past 6 months seemed to hit him all at once. The exhaustion, the guarded expression, the way she held herself like she was always bracing for something. You should have told me, he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than her. Olivia's expression didn't change. Maybe, she said, or maybe I did exactly what I had to do. Ethan didn't say anything for a while after Olivia finished speaking. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because everything he thought he knew about the past 6 months had just been pulled out from under him. He leaned back slightly against the cold brick wall of the alley, staring somewhere past her, like he needed distance just to think. It was strange he had spent months trying to find an explanation, building his own version of the story piece by piece, convincing himself that it made sense. But now, standing here, hearing the truth from her directly, he realized how wrong he had been. Not just about why she left, but about everything. My father, he repeated quietly, almost to himself, like saying it out loud might make it easier to understand. It didn't. If anything, it made it worse. Because the more he thought about it, the more it fit. The subtle comments, the way his father used to look at Olivia like she didn't belong, the constant pressure disguised as concern. Ethan had seen it all before. He just hadn't seen it clearly when it mattered. Or maybe he had and chose to ignore it because it was easier. That thought made his stomach tighten. Olivia didn't interrupt him. She just stood there watching, waiting. Not expecting anything, which somehow made it harder. If she had been yelling, accusing him, it might have been simpler. But this quiet distance, this calm certainty in her words, it left him with nowhere to hide. I didn't know, he said finally, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded weak. Not wrong, but not enough. Olivia's expression didn't change much, but there was a slight shift, something like tired acknowledgement. I figured, she said. You never did. There was no sarcasm in it, no edge, just a flat kind of truth that landed heavier than anger ever could. Ethan let out a slow breath, running his hand through his hair again. He felt exposed in a way he wasn't used to. In his world, he was always in control. He made decisions, solved problems, fixed things before they got out of hand. But this was something he had failed to see coming entirely. And worse, it had hurt the one person who should have been able to rely on him. I should have known, he corrected himself, his voice quieter now. I should have paid attention. You tried to tell me, didn't you? Olivia hesitated, then gave a small nod a few times. She said, not directly at first. I didn't even realize how serious it was in the beginning. I thought maybe I was overreacting. But every time I brought it up, you shut it down so quickly that I started to doubt myself instead. She looked away for a second, like the memory itself was uncomfortable. After a while, it just felt pointless. That hit harder than anything else she had said. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so simple. He had made her feel like her concerns didn't matter. Like she didn't matter enough to be heard. And he hadn't even realized he was doing it. Ethan pushed himself off the wall, pacing a few steps before stopping again. I thought I was keeping things balanced, he said, more to himself than to her. Work, family, everything. I thought if I just handled things the way I always had, everything would stay stable. He let out a short, humorless laugh. I didn't even notice that you were slipping away right in front of me. Olivia didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was softer but not forgiving. You noticed, she said. You just didn't think it was important enough to stop and figure out why. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the truth of it settling in deeper than he wanted to admit. She was right. He had seen the changes, the way she had gotten quieter, the way she stopped pushing back, the way she started withdrawing, but he had explained it away every time. Stress, adjustment, temporary things that would fix themselves. I thought you were unhappy with the lifestyle, he said after a moment. The events, the expectations, I thought you just needed time to get used to it. Olivia looked at him again, something sharper returning to her gaze. I wasn't unhappy with the lifestyle, she said. I was unhappy because I felt alone in it. There's a difference. The words hung between them, simple but impossible to ignore. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I see that now. And he did. Not all at once, not perfectly. But enough to understand that the problem had never been about money or status or any of the things he had assumed. It had been about presence, about listening, about actually showing up in a way that mattered. He glanced at her again, at the way she stood there with one hand still resting protectively on her stomach, and something shifted inside him. The situation wasn't just about the past anymore. It wasn't just about what had gone wrong between them. There was something else now. Someone else. You've been doing all of this alone, he said, his voice quieter again. Doctor visits, everything. Olivia let out a small breath. There haven't been many doctor visits, she admitted. I go when I can. When I can afford it. Ethan frowned immediately. What do you mean, when you can afford it? Olivia, he stopped himself, catching the edge in his own voice. She didn't need that, not now. I managed, she said simply, cutting him off before he could push further. It's not ideal, but it's enough. Ethan shook his head, frustration building, not at her but at the situation, at himself. It's not enough, he said. Not for you. Not for the baby. The words came out firmer this time, more certain. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. I don't need you to tell me what's enough, she replied. I've been making those decisions on my own for months. I know, Ethan said quickly. I know you have. And I'm not saying you didn't do what you had to do. I'm saying you shouldn't have had to do it alone. That was the difference. That was the part he couldn't get past. She had carried all of this by herself while he had been living his life, unaware, thinking the worst of her. Olivia studied him for a moment, like she was trying to figure out if he really meant it or if this was just guilt talking. And what exactly are you saying? She asked carefully. Ethan met her gaze, holding it this time instead of looking away. I'm saying I want to fix this, he said. Not just what happened between us, but this situation. You shouldn't be working long shifts like this, not in your condition. You need proper care. A safe place to stay, stability. He paused, choosing his next words more carefully. Let me help. There it was. The line that changed everything. Olivia's expression hardened almost immediately. Help, she repeated. You mean step in now after everything and just take over? Ethan shook his head. No, not take over, support. There's a difference. Olivia crossed her arms slightly, a defensive instinct kicking in. And what happens when your father finds out, she asked. Because he will. He always does. And then what? You think he's just going to back off because you ask him to? Ethan didn't answer right away, not because he didn't have one, but because this was the part he hadn't fully faced yet. Standing up to his father wasn't something he had ever really done before. Not in a way that mattered. But as he stood there, looking at Olivia, at everything she had been through because of that silence, he realized something had already changed. Then I deal with him, he said finally. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady in a way that surprised even him. Properly this time. Olivia searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt. You've never dealt with him before, she said. Not really, Ethan nodded. I know, he admitted, but I should have, and I will now. It wasn't a grand declaration, it wasn't dramatic. But there was something different in the way he said it. Something grounded in the weight of everything he had just learned. For the first time since they stepped into that alley, Olivia didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, watching him, like she was trying to decide whether this version of him was real or just temporary. And Ethan understood that. He didn't expect her to believe him right away. Not after everything. But for the first time in months, he wasn't trying to convince himself of something that wasn't true. He knew exactly where he had gone wrong. And more importantly, he knew he didn't want to make the same mistake again. Ethan didn't go back to the restaurant after that. He walked Olivia to the edge of the alley, but she stopped him before they reached the street. Like there was an invisible line she wasn't ready to let him cross yet. I still have a shift, she said, her tone calm again, almost distant, like the conversation they just had been carefully folded away. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her she shouldn't be working at all, not like this. Not when she was this close to giving birth, but he stopped himself. Pushing too hard now would only make her shut down again. Can I at least come back later? He asked instead. Olivia hesitated, then shook her head slightly. Not tonight. I need time to think. It wasn't a rejection, not exactly, but it wasn't acceptance either. It was a boundary, and for once Ethan didn't try to cross it. He nodded, stepping back. Okay, he said, I'll wait. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment, the city lights stretching endlessly outside his window, but for once, he didn't feel like he was on top of anything. Everything felt uncertain in a way he wasn't used to. His phone buzzed a few times, emails, messages, things that normally demanded his attention, but he ignored them. His mind kept circling back to Olivia, to the way she looked, to what she said about his father. And the more he thought about it, the more something inside him settled into place. A decision not fully formed yet, but solid enough that he couldn't ignore it. He had spent too long avoiding this. That ended now. The next morning he didn't go to work. Instead, he drove straight to his father's office. The building itself was exactly what you would expect: tall, polished, intimidating in a quiet, deliberate way. It had always made Ethan feel a certain kind of pride walking into it, like he was stepping into something powerful, something permanent. Today, it just felt heavy, familiar in a way that suddenly made him uncomfortable. His father's assistant looked surprised to see him. Mr. Carter isn't expecting you, she said politely. Ethan gave a small nod. That's fine. I'm not here for a meeting. He didn't wait for permission. He walked past her, straight to the door he had entered hundreds of times before, and pushed it open. His father looked up from his desk, irritation flickering across his face before it smoothed into something more controlled. Ethan, he said. You could have called. His tone was calm, measured, but there was always something beneath it. Expectation, authority. Ethan noticed it more clearly now than he ever had before. "We need to talk," Ethan said, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He stayed standing, hands at his sides, like he needed to remind himself to stay grounded. His father leaned back slightly, studying him. "That sounds serious," he said. "Is this about the Henderson deal?" Ethan shook his head. "No. This is about Olivia." That was enough. She was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. His father's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Olivia," he repeated. "I thought that situation was resolved." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, so did I." There was a pause, just long enough to stretch the tension between them. Then Ethan spoke again, more directly this time. "I saw her last night." His father didn't react immediately. He just watched him, waiting. "She's pregnant," Ethan added. That got a reaction, not surprise, something else. "Calculation, maybe. Is she?" his father said. It wasn't a question. Ethan took a step forward. "And before you say anything else, I know about what you said to her, about the threats, about the money." He didn't raise his voice, but there was something different in it now. Something that hadn't been there before. His father's gaze didn't waver. "And you believe her?" he asked calmly. Ethan almost laughed at that, but there was nothing funny about it. "Yes," he said, "I do." Another pause. Then his father stood up slowly, walking around the desk. "Ethan," he said, his tone shifting slightly, softer, almost reasonable. "You need to think about this carefully. That girl don't—" Ethan cut in, sharper this time. "Don't call her that." His father stopped just for a second. That was new. "You were letting emotions cloud your judgment," his father continued, ignoring the interruption. "She left you. She walked away without explanation, and now she comes back with a story that conveniently paints me as the villain." Ethan shook his head. "She didn't come back. I found her. She's been working, living on her own, trying to stay hidden." "Does that sound like someone trying to manipulate me?" His father's expression hardened slightly. "People do desperate things when they see an opportunity," he said. "Especially when a child is involved." Ethan felt the frustration rise, but he forced himself to stay steady. "She was desperate because of you," he said. "Because you threatened to take her child away. Our family's child," his father corrected immediately, and there it was, clear, unapologetic. Ethan stared at him, something cold settling in his chest. "It's not a business asset," he said quietly. "It's my child and hers." His father's jaw tightened. "You were not thinking clearly," he said. "You were letting sentiment get in the way of reality. That woman does not belong in this family. She never did." For a second, Ethan almost fell into the old pattern, the one where he would hesitate, second-guess himself, look for a compromise. But then he thought about Olivia standing in that alley, tired, guarded, alone, and something inside him held firm. "Then maybe this family is the problem," he said. The words landed harder than he expected. His father went completely still. "Be careful, Ethan," he said, his voice lower now. "You don't walk away from this lightly." "I'm not walking away," Ethan replied. "I'm choosing." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Olivia and the baby are my priority, not the business, not the name, not you." The silence that followed was heavier than anything else in the room. His father studied him, like he was seeing him for the first time. "You were serious," he said finally. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "I am." His father's expression shifted again, but this time it wasn't controlled. It was something closer to anger, edged with disbelief. "You would throw everything away for her?" he asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I almost lost everything that actually matters because I didn't choose her before," he said. "I'm not making that mistake again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "but not as much as I would if I did nothing." He turned then, heading for the door. His father didn't stop him this time. "If you walk out now," he said, "don't expect things to stay the same." Ethan paused with his hand on the handle, just for a second. Then he opened the door. "That's the point," he said, and walked out. Later that day, Ethan found himself standing outside the cafe again. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't know if she would even want to see him. But he was there anyway. When Olivia stepped out after her shift and saw him, she looked surprised, then cautious. "You said you needed time," he said before she could speak. "I know, I needed to do something first." She studied him for a moment. "What kind of something?" Ethan met her gaze, steady this time. "I talked to him," he said. "My father." Olivia's expression changed slightly, something unreadable passing through it. "And?" she asked. Ethan didn't rush the answer. "And I told him he doesn't get to decide anything about you or the baby anymore," he said. "Not now ever." Olivia didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, like she was trying to figure out if this was real, if it would last. "That doesn't change everything," she said finally. "I know," Ethan replied. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm just asking you to see that I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago." Olivia let out a quiet breath, her hand resting again on her stomach. I don't know if that's enough, she said. Ethan nodded. Then we start with what is enough, he said, one step at a time. And for the first time, she didn't immediately pull away. The weeks that followed didn't feel like a dramatic transformation. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no perfect moments where everything just fell back into place. Instead, things changed slowly, almost quietly, in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Olivia did move in with Ethan. Not at first. She accepted his help, but on her terms. A better place to stay, regular doctor visits, proper meals, things she needed, not things that came with conditions, and Ethan respected that. That, more than anything, was new. He showed up consistently, not with grand gestures, not with empty promises, but in small, steady ways that built something real over time. He drove her to appointments when she let him, sat in waiting rooms without complaining, listened when she spoke, even when what she said wasn't easy to hear. There were moments when Olivia would pull back, when something he said or did reminded her too much of the past. And instead of pushing through it like he used to, Ethan learned to stop, to give her space, to let her come back on her own. Trust didn't return all at once, it came in pieces. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A moment where she didn't flinch when he reached out. The first time she let him feel the baby kick without hesitation. Each of those moments mattered more than anything else he had ever achieved, and for the first time in his life, Ethan understood why. The apartment he had arranged stayed mostly quiet. Olivia chose the room farthest from his, and neither of them questioned it. They lived in the same space, but not in the same way they once had. It wasn't a return to what they were. It was something new, something uncertain, something that required patience neither of them had ever practiced before. Some nights, they ate together. Other nights, she stayed in her room, and he didn't knock. There were no expectations, no pressure to pretend things were fine. And oddly, that honesty made things easier. By the time the doctor started talking about due dates in weeks instead of months, everything felt sharper. More immediate. Olivia moved slower now, her body heavy with the final stretch of pregnancy. And even though she tried not to show it, Ethan could see the exhaustion in the way she carried herself. He noticed everything now. The small pauses when she stood up, the way she shifted when sitting for too long, the quiet sighs she thought he didn't hear. You don't have to do everything yourself, he said one evening as she struggled slightly to reach something on a shelf. Olivia gave him a look, half amused, half tired. I've been doing everything myself for a while, she replied. But she stepped back anyway, letting him grab it for her. It was a small thing, but it meant something. The night it happened, it didn't start dramatically, no panic, no sudden rush. Just a quiet knock on his door in the middle of the night. Ethan woke up immediately, disoriented for half a second before opening it. Olivia stood there, one hand pressed against her side, her breathing controlled but different. I think it's time, she said. No panic in her voice, just certainty. Everything after that moved faster than he expected. Not chaotic, but urgent in a way that didn't leave room for overthinking. The hospital, the paperwork, the waiting, it all blurred together. What didn't blur was her. The way she gripped his hand during contractions. The way she tried to stay strong even when the pain clearly overwhelmed her. The moments when she closed her eyes and just focused on getting through 1 second at a time. I can't do this, she said at one point, her voice breaking in a way he hadn't heard before. Ethan shook his head immediately, not even thinking about it. You can, he said, his grip tightening around her hand. You've done everything else. You've made it this far. You're not alone this time. It wasn't some perfect, rehearsed line. It was simple and it was true. Hours passed, maybe more. Time didn't really matter in that room. Everything narrowed down to her, to the rhythm of her breathing, to the doctors guiding her through each step. And then, suddenly it changed. The tension broke, replaced by something else entirely, a sound, sharp, small, undeniable. A cry. Ethan didn't realize he had been holding his breath until that moment. Olivia did too. They both looked at the same time, like they needed confirmation that it was real. The doctor said something he didn't even fully register the words at first, but then the nurse placed the baby in Olivia's arms. And everything else faded. He's here, Olivia whispered, her voice shaking slightly, not from fear this time but from something else entirely. Relief. Maybe even a little disbelief. Ethan stepped closer, slower than he had ever moved in his life, like he was afraid that rushing would somehow break the moment. He looked down at the tiny, fragile life in her arms, and something inside him shifted in a way he couldn't fully explain. Their son. Not an idea, not a possibility, real. Olivia looked up at him then, her eyes tired but softer than they had been in months. Do you want to hold him? She asked. There was hesitation in the question, not because she didn't want him to, but because it meant something. It was trust, even if it was small. Ethan nodded, his throat tight, and carefully took the baby from her. He had never held something so small before, so dependent, so completely unaware of everything that had happened before this moment. The baby's tiny hand moved slightly, fingers curling instinctively, and Ethan felt it like something grounding him completely in the present. "Hey," he said quietly, almost without thinking, "I'm here." Olivia watched him, really watched him, and something in her expression changed again. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to matter. They didn't suddenly become a perfect family after that. Things didn't magically fix themselves. There were still conversations they hadn't had, wounds that hadn't fully healed, trust that was still fragile. But something important had shifted. They were no longer standing on opposite sides of the same problem. They were standing on the same side now, even if they were still figuring out how to stand together. Later, when the room had quieted and the world outside felt far away, Olivia leaned back slightly, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Ethan sat beside her, their son resting between them, small and impossibly calm after everything. "This doesn't fix everything," she said softly, not looking at him. "I know," Ethan replied. "But it's a start," she added after a moment. Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it is." And for the first time since everything fell apart, that felt like enough. If there's one thing this story made me realize, it's how easy it is to lose something important without even noticing it's slipping away. Ethan didn't lose Olivia in a single moment. It wasn't one big mistake. It was a series of small choices, choosing work over conversations, choosing comfort over confrontation, choosing silence when he should have paid attention. And that feels very real, because in real life most relationships don't break suddenly, they fade quietly. What stayed with me the most wasn't the drama or the conflict with his father. It was Olivia leaving without a word. Not because she didn't care, but because she felt like she had no safe place left to stay. That kind of loneliness, being in a relationship but still feeling unheard, that's probably one of the hardest things to admit. And the fact that she didn't try to come back for help, even when things got difficult, says a lot about how deeply that trust had been broken. Ethan's change also didn't feel like some perfect redemption. He didn't suddenly become a better person overnight. What made it believable was that he started small. He listened. He stopped assuming. He respected her space even when he didn't like it. That's not dramatic, but it's probably the only kind of change that actually lasts. I think the story also quietly challenges the idea that love is enough on its own. Ethan loved Olivia, that much is clear. But it didn't stop him from hurting her, because love without attention, without presence, without action, it doesn't really protect anyone. And on the other side, Olivia still had feelings for him, but she didn't let that override her need to feel safe. That balance felt honest. The ending doesn't try to pretend everything is fixed, and I like that. They don't suddenly become a perfect couple again. They're just trying, and maybe that's the point. Not every story needs a clean resolution. Sometimes it's enough that people recognize where they went wrong and choose to do better, even if it's messy and uncertain. If anything, this story feels less like a romance and more like a reminder that the people we think will always be there won't be, if we don't actually show up for them. And by the time we realize that, it might already be too late, or if we're lucky, just almost too late.